how evil should Sauron be portrayed in the Rings of Power? He does show in a fair form, so in a sense, he might want to try to trick the people around him that, hey, I'm a good guy, right? So Mark argues that actually Sauron showing kindness to Galadriel and saving her life in Season 1 is very much against his character. Tune in to the rest of this episode to learn more about Sauron as he is portrayed in the lore. And don't forget to like and subscribe. So with that, let's dive right in. Welcome, my lords, to the White City, where you will learn more about Middle-earth and discover differences and similarities between the Rings of Power show and Tolkien's books, and whether Amazon's show, episode by episode, is worth watching. I'm Philip Dutt, your host, and I'll be joined by Matt Vandervoort and Mark Schaefer. I hope you enjoy. Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in to the White City Podcast. During this intermission between Season 2 and Season 3 of The Rings of Power, you'll find us talking about different characters of Middle-earth and artifacts of Middle-earth, along with the Lord of the Rings trilogy movies and the War of the Rohirrim. If you want to listen to our Season 1 review, then go to the beginning of the podcast at any audio platform. Or if you want to listen to our Season 2 review, go to YouTube or an audio platform and search Season 2 review. There will also be new guests on the show with good amounts of Tolkien and lore expertise. So a lot of things to look forward to. Today I have back with me Mark Schaefer.
How's it going?
Yes. Good to be in person again. And yeah, so we'll be talking about Sauron and some about his, well, just mostly about, his kind of his journey and relating that to Rings of Power in a lot of ways, some lore things and differences in his character between the Rings of Power and the lore and how that might be played out in kind of a worldview setting idea. So, yeah.
Well, to start with Sauron, you just start at the very beginning of Tolkien's lore of the Silmarillion, because Sauron is an Ainur, so he's actually created by Eru Ilúvatar, and so he was there making the music of the Ainur. Actually, one of my favorite lines from The Rings of Power is Sauron. He said something like, I was there whenever the first, I've had many names because I was there from the first sound of the world, or something like that. And it's true. He really was there at the very beginning. So, yeah. Sauron actually originally started out, obviously, as a good Maiar. He was under Aule, the Maiar, or the Valar, who was associated with, smithing and crafting. And of Aule's, the ones who served under him, the Maiar who served under him, a lot of them actually turned bad. So, Saruman was also a member of Aule, of Aule's Maiar. And therefore, Sauron, maybe even Sauron and Saruman were probably pretty close actually back then.
Saruman. Sauron and Saruman
were both Maiar of Aule.
Oh, okay, I gotcha.
So this actually sort of is maybe a really a message Tolkien's trying to send, that this idea of creation, because you think of this with Feanor too, right? He's also a craftsman. This idea of creating beauty is one of the best things you can do, but also one of the most dangerous things you can do, because by creating beauty, you're also risking taking pride in your work and elevating yourself above others because of what you can create. You see this Feanor who looks down at his brothers, his half brothers, and sees them as less. I think it's true with Sauron too. Then there's this desire for more. And that's also what Tolkien sees as evil, right? Is that not being satisfied with where you are, but always wanting more. And this is true of Sauron's master Morgoth, who always wanted to, he wanted to set up his own universe and be the master of his own universe. And eventually he persuades Sauron. So Sauron joins him, and we don't know a lot about Sauron in some of the early stories. Where he really shows up first is Beren and Lúthien's story, actually, where he traps Beren and some elf kings, and he's called the Lord of Werewolves. Yeah, and I think to keep this podcast a little bit, maybe episode a little bit briefer, because Sauron shows up a lot after that point of lore. But then there's this real contrast between Sauron and Morgoth. Morgoth originally is able to take a fair form, but eventually in the story he loses that ability, especially after his fight with Fingolfin, where he's badly injured. But Sauron is actually keeps his ability for a lot longer. And so Sauron is, while Morgoth is the powerful evil enemy that's there, Sauron is always seen as the deceiver. He's the one who sneaks into the enemy camp and is always there trying to trick them. And he succeeds on several occasions throughout Tolkien's lore. And so I think that's sort of like his role originally in most of the stories that we see. And whenever Morgoth is finally thrown down, Sauron actually like repents to like the chief of the Maiar. He repents and he's like, please like spare my life. And so the guy doesn't put him in chains right away, and then he escapes. And so there's this question of like whether or not that was actually genuine. You know, Tolkien talks about that a little bit in the book, but that like something that originally like his repentance was genuine. But pretty clearly by the time the Second Age rolls around, you know, he is a bad guy once again, and he's out to rule the peoples of Middle Earth. And this is sort of where the Rings of Power picks up. And I think, I mean, my beef with the Rings of Power show about the portrayal of Sauron is always that, like, Sauron in the Second Age, you know, there's this question of whether he repented, whether he was really being genuine or not. But the Second Age rolls around, he's the bad guy. Morgoth is gone. Sauron's the new head of the bad guys. And so he's the person trying to control Middle Earth. Also, an interesting thing that the show teases out a little bit is that, you know, Morgoth is the destroyer. This is somewhat true. Morgoth couldn't control Middle Earth, and therefore he sought to, or Arda as it was called at the time, he sought to destroy it. And Sauron's more about control, because he wants to control people and control the free peoples of Middle Earth. So we see this a lot throughout the stories, is he gives people rings because he wants to turn them into wraiths so he can control them. He's not just about just killing them. He wants the power over them. He'll kill them to do it. But, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. Yeah.
Should we keep moving along, or you want to talk about something specifically?
Well, I think. Well, I mean, I guess we can. All right. So there's one thing that is interesting. Is how like his, you know, at one point he was very much the kind of Lord of Werewolves, and after that you don't really, I mean, okay, and like the Rings of Power, they do kind of show him like, you know, changing between forms, which is that, but I don't know, it's just interesting.
He spends a suspicious amount of time looking like the same dude, right? One is an elf lord and one is a man, but like same dude, right? So like they could have definitely played it up a little bit more. Obviously they want to use their actor they paid a lot of money for, and not too much of a VFX budget. I will say that there's this one scene where, and I forget the guy's name, Adar kills Sauron and the rest of the orcs. I think that scene I wasn't a huge fan of for several reasons. I think the character of Adar in Rings of Power was very interesting, but this idea that like Sauron was sort of disconnected. He was like too clever to sort of be caught with like that. And I thought that was sort of portrayed him as weak and not powerful. As well as like he turns into this black goop, but it's pretty clear that like Sauron's power is like a mystical spirit-based power. And therefore like this idea that he becomes like this symbiote who's like crawling and like on the earth, tried to make it seem like very primordial, whereas I think it would have been more accurate to say that his soul left his body and eventually somewhere else was able to take shape, not because he like was this little black goop. Just my little nitpicking with, you know, based off of the magic powers. But I think the larger message behind Tolkien's worldview is that for most of Tolkien's most important stories, obviously like Morgoth is the enemy, but most of them it's like Sauron. This is what Tolkien sees as pure evil and the evil that needs to be confronted. And, you know, the whole like message of Tolkien's story, or maybe the largest theme, is that, you know, evil isn't resisted by, you know, the acts of really big, powerful people, but it's resisted by the common actions of everyday people, right? It's the hobbits who end up, you know, are able to resist Sauron and end up defeating him. And this is a theme that's proved over and over again in Tolkien's lore. And so I think it's really important to like ask ourselves, like, what is this evil that like everyday common people are resisting? I think that's something that the Rings of Power maybe doesn't really capture very well, because Sauron's not even a main villain for the first season, because he's like hidden as this other person. And he's sort of like questioning himself. And of course, my biggest pet peeve is that he saved Galadriel's life. So definitely, like, we would have never done that in the actual story. But yeah.
Yeah, something that's a little bit more of a side thing from Rings of Power, but something that I've thought about since listening to the Mordor part of Frodo and Sam moving through Mordor. And like it's interesting that you have them putting on the ring like in Mordor, where like the ring's maybe gonna have like its like strongest power, maybe even there's gonna be strongest ties to like Sauron or even the Witch King. And it's like it almost seems like Sauron like isn't even sure that the ring is there, because he's so easily, well, maybe not easily, but because he is like, hey, Aragorn's sending the troops out here at the Black Gate, everybody go. It's like, so I don't know. You ever thought about that, like Sauron knowing or even like thinking that the ring might be in Mordor?
Yeah, so I think it's really clear that part of the strategy to destroy the ring is that Sauron couldn't conceive of that. This is to go on to another one of my pet peeves, is the quick tangent to the Star Wars universe, is that, you know, the whole thing of blowing up the Death Star, and everyone's like, oh, this is like a big flaw in the plan. It was that actually the truth was the Empire never conceived that somebody would fly a single man like spaceship up to, you know, a big battle station. That just wasn't in their ideas, and that was really the clear thing. And then they made this whole Rogue One to explain that mistake. And the similar way is that like Sauron wanted power. That's what he craves above all else, right? So to see that idea that anybody would destroy power is completely without like out of his mind. He never once conceived of this until the very end when Frodo puts it on in Mount Doom that this was actually their plan. So he's constantly throughout this story of Lord of the Rings, he's looking to see, hey, who has taken the ring and who do I need to oppose? So he thinks that at certain points that Aragorn has taken the ring for himself, or maybe even Gandalf at some point. But he thinks that one of these people for sure will have taken the ring. He also thinks Saruman has taken the ring at some point. So he's looking to see who do I need to beat in a straight up fight. He's never conceiving that like somebody will try to destroy the ring, because it's power, right? That's what the ring is. It's like crystallized power, and will grant anybody whatever they want, the power that they want. And therefore, like, yeah, I think that's why he never suspects, why he's easily tricked by them at the end. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, I mean, it kind of plays into what you were saying about the little people being kind of inconspicuous and, you know, like even Saruman kind of downplaying the hobbits, you know, in a sense, maybe in that kind of same idea in a lot of ways.
And it's interesting, right? Because Sauron captures Gollum at some point, and he tortures information out of him. It's interesting because in the movies they portray Sauron as this like giant eye that's up in the building, but in the books actually it's pretty clear that Sauron, he has a very distinctive eye, and he looks through the palantir with it, and there's like the symbol of the eye, but he actually has taken human form somewhat again, and therefore it's actually literally him who tortured Gollum. Gollum talks about like the hand of Sauron is black, and it only has 4 fingers on it because, you know, one was cut off by Isildur. Yeah, so I think it's interesting that like he lets Gollum go, and Gollum is actually the one who ends up destroying the ring, right? So it's this idea that like he never thought Gollum could ever do him harm again, so he releases him, thinking that, oh, you'd only do harm to my enemies because he'll always try to find the ring. But Gollum actually is the one who destroys him in the end. So it's like you exactly said it. He's constantly underestimating the power of people, ordinary people. Yeah. I think it's also, you know, when Sauron talks about like he's the fair one, right? Like this was originally his disguise. He would always go about, he's actually able to trick the elves, which is like, you know, few people, like even Morgoth in his heyday, had a hard time tricking the elves, but he's able to do it. And he, you know, tears Numenor apart when he couldn't do it with his armies. He's able to do it with his will. But this idea like ordinary people aren't maybe easily deceived because they're not like, Tolkien uses the line, right? Everything that glitters is not gold. Mm-hmm. Or all that is gold does not glitter. So it's the opposite.
Yeah,
the principle that like Sauron's able to glitter very well, but it's like, you know, people who are able to resist him are people like Aragorn and, you know, the hobbits who are like simple people. Aragorn, you know, is a king, but he lived a very simple life, right? He was a simple ranger from the north. People who are used to sort of, you know, everyday trials. Yeah. I think also there's this concept that like Sauron is this like really great evil, but it's not like, what do the hobbits do to beat Sauron? It's like they resist the ring and they travel, right? That's like that's what they do, right? And I think that's also a really important part, that Sauron's looking to be beaten by a big army, and so that's where his eye is always on, as these like giant fights are going across Middle Earth. And the hobbits, I mean, this is like sort of the interesting part about Lord of the Rings, and actually why a lot of people don't like the movies and books, is that like Frodo is the main character and he doesn't do hardly anything, right? he struggles with the ring. But yeah, he struggles with the ring pretty much the whole movie. It's like this internal struggle. the whole story. And at the end, like Sam, has some like moments, but even him is just like they're just traveling, right? It's like this journey through like really dangerous and difficult places. But that's what ends up winning the day in the end. I think that is says a lot about like what Tolkien thinks about like good and evil. Interesting too that the Hobbit's actually based off Sam, especially was based off of Tolkien's experience during the World War One. And so he saw like the ordinary soldiers who are every day like living in this, this. I mean, obviously, like World War One trenches were like a hellscape, right, to the people who were living there, and he saw them be able to resist that sort of evil and degrading system and life for these ordinary people back home in England, and that I think made a great impression upon him whenever he's talking about like I think World War II too, right? He's thinking that like people who are resisting Nazis and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'd like to learn more about that side of like Tolkien's life and perspective that influenced the creation of those characters in a lot of ways. And so yeah, one thing that got me that didn't really make sense, in my opinion, and I mean, and I'm not really even like deep knowledge of the lore kind of guy, but I thought it was odd that Sauron Annatar would come back to the elves as Annatar, or as as Halbrand, right? Who they had just basically said he's Sauron. Okay, the idea is that Celebrimbor doesn't know that he is Sauron, but they also don't really play that out very well. So it's interesting to me. I think it would have been a better story on Sauron's part to show that that he would have come in as somebody different. I don't know.
They messed up the plot badly. So it's interesting, right? Because Sauron actually in the books is actually sort of saying that he's from the Valar. So he's actually saying that he's like a Maiar, like Gandalf or
one of the wizards,
one of the wizards, exactly. Yeah. So he's saying like when he's coming as Annatar that like I'm from Valinor, I'm like one of the wizards. Therefore, like this actually was very, very plausible, right? Because we actually do have Astari coming to Middle Earth, and also like would make sense why he was in a fair form. And most of those elves had never been to Valinor. One of the few exceptions was Celebrimbor because I think he was there, like he was old enough to be there. But so like this idea that like this explains everything about him and what he presented himself as, and he's able to present himself very well in that respect. And I think that sort of plot wise makes a lot of sense, right? That he would deceive them in this way. Also makes sense why he's trying to build powerful rings, right? He's like, I was sent here to help you build these weapons to defeat Sauron, and therefore like this all sort of falls into place. And in the show, it was sort of very convoluted and wasn't really clear, and it was very clear that he was deceiving some people and using little force pushes to like kill some people. Very 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 sleight of hand rather than like sort of this grand scheme. I think that was sort of portrayed in the books and made a lot more sense in the books.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting with him and Celebrimbor, I mean, I don't know all the ins and outs of this, of this part of the lore necessarily, but knowing enough that Sauron actually is like the one who like brings the army, and he's not the one at Eregion, right?
Yeah,
he's the one who actually brings the army against Eregion, and then like gets Celebrimbor, and then puts him on the spear or whatever with his army.
So they create the 16 rings of power together, and then Sauron goes back to Mordor and creates the one ring. And while he's gone, the elves create the 3 rings of the elves. And when Sauron puts on the one ring, they literally every ring bearer can hear him say the poem, one ring
like the dark,
all, like one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, which is like a really like I can't believe they didn't do that in the show, because can you imagine like every ring bearer is like, oh, Sauron is like one tricked us and he's coming to get us because he's coming to get all the rings and bind them. So instantly this like sends a panic, and they realize that he's Annatar, and then he comes back with an army and like fights Celebrimbor, and the Celebrimbor now knows who he is and has sent off the 3 elven rings, but there's still the 16 rings of power, and Sauron wins because he has the one ring, right? That's a big part of why he wins. So I think also that flipping that order around did not make a lot of sense.
Right, because it's just thinking about that would make Eregion such a more like intense battle, right? More high
Exactly.
stakes because he's coming to get the rings, and you're yeah,
And I think there was something that like, oh, of course, like Sauron is gonna like the Eregion's gonna fall, right? Because Sauron is literally already inside, right? And like there's this giant army outside, and I don't know. I didn't feel like it was his largest stakes. I think it would have been much cooler to have like even like a doomed Eregion's last stand, and Celebrimbor like going for one all out like hammer attack against him or something, right? You could have had some very dramatic moments. I thought Celebrimbor's last words in the show were pretty good.
yeah,
Sort of
yeah,
more like what he says in the books, prophesying that Sauron will
yeah.
be defeated. But yeah, I thought they could have done it better.
They could have done better. Yeah, because I think seeing Celebrimbor as 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 more of a warrior than just you know some dude who like kind of is the politician who doesn't fight.
Yeah,
I think that would have it would have I mean it would have made things just more interesting in the end because I don't know, I feel like that in a sense, maybe not just like magic wise, but Celebrimbor could have been more powerful. And in a sense to be able to like go up against Sauron to a certain extent.
yeah. I think it's actually really important. I said this before in Lord of the Rings, that, like it's a soft magic system. There's not like rules around how the magic works. Like, but it's important that like Celebrimbor had magic, right? Like they created magical rings without Sauron before he even came. And his system helped them make more powerful magic. But like this whole idea in the book that like, or sorry, in the show of Rings of Power, that Sauron is sort of like these rings are sort of new or magical. They're like more powerful and they're new, but like this idea that like magic didn't exist without them. I think it's also really important to realize like somebody who can create magic in Tolkien's world and like create magical items are usually like powerful people too, right? And this is the thing, like Galadriel is like a magically powerful person, not because she like swings a sword around better or says a special magical spell, but like there's power behind who she is and like her presence. And Celebrimbor has some of that too. I mean, he was in Valinor
Right.
and also, was able to build these magical items but without even having Sauron's help. I think
Yeah.
that's sort of like right. They draw these really specific lines in Rings of Power where Galadriel is the fighter. She's a soldier, and then Gil-galad is like this. The noble or something, and Elrond's like the politician or the messenger, and then you have like Celebrimbor the smith, and it's actually like they all sort of did these things. They all had these roles. Elrond also was like able to build things that were like magical. You see this how he builds Rivendell, and Galadriel also has this power, and maybe they were specialized more in one area, but like very the show had to play like tropes or whatever, and these characters are more complicated and fleshed out, I think, in
Yeah.
Tolkien's lore.
But I guess not even just like magic. I'm thinking about too just the ability to fight with a sword. I guess like I feel like most characters in Middle Earth maybe just like should be able to pick up a sword and like go fight. I mean like the
Swing it.
hobbits do it, right? I mean, come on. But like I feel like
Still
that
see plot holes in the original story.
I'm just saying you like see like elves like Elrond and I mean Gil-galad and like all these guys are like I mean they should be able to like to fight in combat.
When you're immortal and live thousands of years, you probably picked up a sword and swung it a couple times, right?
Yeah, I
Like,
mean after all after all your the experiences with the Silmarils and everything and everybody killing
yeah,
each other. Yeah, sure. So like it's just one of those things where it's like the hobbits, go into a land where it's like they're not used to having like that go into like this epic place where like everybody is like prepared to fight against the evil. And anyways, even if you're high up in the elven society, like I feel like that's even more of a reason for you to be able to like, all right, guys, we're just going to go fight these people. But
yeah. It's interesting too, right? Because like, as a grandson of Feanor, I mean, like all of the high elves in Middle Earth, like had a long history of conflict, right? But the reason they came to Middle Earth was for war, right? To take back the Silmarils from Morgoth, and it's just a long history of conflict with
right,
Morgoth. And so it's like, yeah, absolutely. Like clearly Celebrimbor would have been a warrior in some respect because he had survived those years, right? So yeah, the show is trying to like again play tropes as the craftsman or the artist, and not really fleshing out these characters. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you got
Any more
yeah,
on Sauron?
any other thoughts? I mean, we could go on a lot of other things, like his attachment to the One Ring and the
Yeah.
power that he's like poured into that
I think
as well.
I think it's interesting. The one time we should just do a episode on the One Ring because I think that's like
Yeah.
sort of its own thing in Tolkien's world. I think it's interesting that like we talked about the Witch King last episode of like him being beaten by Eowyn and Merry teaming up. That when you talk about how Sauron's beaten, it's originally by like a bunch of friends teaming up. It's this when you talk about like if Sauron is the ultimate like evil, what beats him in Tolkien's world is like what Tolkien thinks is the best good. And it's this like deep personal friendship between Elendil and Gil-galad that like leads into the Last Alliance. They're both the kings of their respective peoples, and they lead them there, and they win the war against Sauron, and they actually are both like personally killed by him together. And ultimately, I think it's interesting, right? That like they both die, but they like their armies win the war, and then Isildur cuts the ring off of Sauron's finger. It's interesting because that moment is like it seems very luck based. That like again, it's like one of these moments where like the ring falls in the lava, right? In Mount Doom. That like
Yeah.
it's like oh, but like these things are meant to happen, and I think there is a part of it that like whenever you think of like how the Witch King died was Eowyn standing up for her father, right? And her father figure because it's actually her uncle, but right? And it's like Isildur standing up for his father who's just been killed by Sauron and cutting off the ring from his finger. So then there's like a lot of like parallels there between like what Tolkien sees as like the ultimate good is these close family relationships, and that's actually what stands up to evil in the end. So those two things maybe is that like the ordinary people doing everyday things and these like close family relationships is what stands up to evil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's good. It's good 2 cents.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. He also the story has it that in Gil-galad he literally picks Gil-galad up and Gil-galad like just bursts into flames because of how hot he is, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
But, like his form was so terrible. Yeah. I think actually Rings of Power, the one place that they could like sort of redeem themselves is like their Numenor storyline when Sauron gets to Numenor and he like corrupts Numenor, because I think that's like the peak of Sauron's deceptive power at work, that like he just like beats the most powerful nation on Middle Earth with his deception. And of course after that he can't really take a fair form anymore because he dies there, and after that he has a hard time taking a fair form again. So yeah, sort of his deceptive play on display. I think they do a pretty good job of that, I think, in the show. Numenor has been one of their better storylines, so I think I'm excited to see. What's interesting is that Tolkien said that when Sauron he has the One Ring before, and then Numenor beats him, and then he's taken back, and Sauron says that he takes the ring with him, but he hides it, and in his spirit form is able to take the ring back to Middle-earth. Really, that was probably just like a plot hole that he had to fix later. But
who you think, Tolkien or
Tolkien? He admits it because one of his fans actually like writes him a letter, and it's like it's hard how the ring when he was in Numenor, because after the Numenor is like destroyed, did he like and he was like, oh, Sauron's deceptive power needed to be amplified by the ring, because to do what he did in Numenor he had to have the ring with him. Therefore, he must have carried it back in spirit form, after Numenor is destroyed along with him.
Oh, interesting. I gotcha.
Because Numenor is destroyed, Sauron's destroyed. After that, he's spoiler alert for Rings of Power.
Yeah,
future seasons.
I guess Sauron wasn't anticipating that one, huh?
No, I think he was. He
okay,
knew he would survive.
so?
But the question is like, how did he get the ring back?
Yeah.
I think it's also. I mean, it's really fascinating. Like Sauron. What is his end goal, right? Because like to conquer Middle Earth, but like he needs to beat the Valinor, right? And he sort of knows he can't do that. It's interesting because whenever he's playing Numenor off against the Valinor, right? He's like go and attack, and they literally like Numenor is the most powerful nation on Earth, and he gets like wiped out, right? Instantly, just like one Maiar goes and like sends a giant tidal wave. Spoiler alert again for the movie, the show.
I truly think most people who are watching the show
At
to this point
are
know
the
everything.
lore.
Like
Yeah.
they just lore people.
Only diehard fans are familiar with the show.
So, I think that's probably the case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if would you think they'll make a season 3?
Oh, they're on it.
They've
Oh,
put
they're
too
on
much
it
money
already.
into it. Sounds
I
good.
mean, yeah, they're on to making it.
I
They're
just-
jumping forward like a few hundred years in time.
I know they have not done financially well with the last one, so
Yeah, fine. So here's the thing. That's a whole entire other episode.
sounds good. Yeah, we just do that. Do you have any last thoughts on Sauron? I don't know. I'm trying to think of something.
No, I don't think so. I mean, besides, I think like the one thing that is interesting is that he's, the reason why he's basically been, destroyed the first time by the ring getting cut off is how much of his power and essence that was put into the ring, right? So that by the ring being taken from him, that takes away most of his power. And so in the same way, by the ring being destroyed entirely, well, maybe it doesn't entirely destroy Sauron necessarily, but put him in a state where we couldn't come back.
Yeah, he's stuck in spirit, like trapped in the void. I think it's also interesting that like, Maiar have this ability to like keep coming back, right? But like that ability seems limited. Therefore, like the more he comes back, the less abilities he has. And it seems that at the end, I think the way Tolkien maybe described it was like the ring is an anchor to like this world, right? So the ring keeps pulling him back to this world even after he's destroyed time and time again. So he needs that anchor there, and whenever it's not gone, he is gone for good.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, what's interesting is in the movies they properly show that when the ring is destroyed, Barad-dûr, Sauron's fortress, collapses. His ring is on top, or his eye is on top, and that's because Sauron actually made the fortress with the power of the ring. And therefore, when the ring is undone, everything that the ring built was also undone, including the fortress. Then they have this giant earthquake that like wipes out all the orcs. That is not in the books and it makes no sense. But yeah. Just obviously you need to have the ending be nice and pretty, right? So
interesting. It's like, yeah. Well, because the land of Mordor wasn't.
the Black Gates also collapse, also in the book, because the
Okay.
Black Gates were also made with the power of the ring.
Okay.
There isn't a giant earthquake that just like swallows all the orcs.
Right.
alive.
It wasn't like, because Sauron was destroyed, all of Mordor was tied to Sauron, therefore all of Mordor like was just.
In fact, they actually had to like hunt down some of the orcs later on and like kill them.
Oh, okay.
So yeah.
that's an interesting thing. They actually had to like make sure like they actually had to like tried to find all the orcs and all. Yeah.
So I think that's pretty interesting. But yeah, it's interesting that like, and whenever evil is destroyed, it's completely undone. I think that maybe that theme is true as it pertains to Sauron. Here's my question. So the rings lost their power after Sauron is destroyed, right?
Yeah.
So all their power is tied to one ring.
Right.
And they say this with the elven rings.
Uh-huh.
What happens to their 8 Nazgul? Do they just join Sauron in the empty nothingness? As being not tied to the world anymore?
That's what I was wondering. In the because in the movie they have one of the rocks or lava like shots that come out of Mount Doom hit on Nazgul.
Yeah.
So, but it's interesting too because I guess the ring race would be tied back to the power of the ring, not tied back to Sauron, right? Because you think about Sauron being at the Battle of the Last Alliance and the ring being cut off, Sauron having his like form kind of destroyed and then having to come back. That didn't affect the ring race at all.
Yep, because they're connected more to the ring. Because I guess my understanding of it would be that their powers, not all their magic powers, because they clearly were people who were magicians and kings before they got the rings, but their ability to stay as like ghosts and wraiths are tied to their rings, and therefore if their rings lose their power, then they are no longer able to stay as wraiths anymore.
Right.
Would that also hold true, you think, of people who were made ghosts by Morgul blades?
Did they just go like disappear into?
They would just disappear along because they created with the power. Is there like this chain of rings where You know, the One Ring makes the 9, and then the 9 make other people wraiths, and then as like the chain loses its power, every other race are gone.
I mean, I think that
Asking the real
is
questions
so.
here.
Here's the thing too: is somebody like having to live strictly in the unseen world? Is that them basically dying if they can't be in the material world?
Yeah. So this is a good question. When people die in Middle Earth, if they're mortals, actually, if they're everybody goes to Valley Nor, but they go to different places in Valley Nor.
Oh, really? Even humans,
Yeah.
though.
Even humans go to the halls of Mandos. Yeah.
Oh, okay. The Halls of Mandos. All right, so
No,
not just like anywhere ethereal, like just
Yeah.
out there.
Sorry. Maybe I'm thinking of the elves go to the hall of Mandos, but then humans go somewhere else.
Because I heard that like
Where their souls go, people don't know. Only Iluvatar knows. Not even the Valar, other Valar know. So yeah. So maybe I should have clarified that. But like, they're going somewhere. They aren't like just disappearing. So maybe that's like the idea is like this soul is tied here, and then they all just go on to Valinor afterwards.
okay.
Though Sauron is specifically said to fall into empty nothingness. Would you also like to comment on that? If do you think Tolkien is an annihilationist in terms of Christian theology, that he believes that hell is just a nothingness rather than eternal torment?
So that's an interesting point because in another episode I was talking about some things with the guest, and that's actually I felt like that's what he was saying would happen to humans. Is that they wouldn't go back to Valinor, that they would just go to the nothingness. And he said that even Frodo would go back to Valinor and wouldn't live forever. That he would just live until like, until he would die, if he was even here. But he would like more of a healing to like the wound that he had and all. But he like eventually, he was saying he would still eventually die.
Interesting. The Valinor is literally called the Undying Lands. I don't want to like. This guy seems like he knows what he's talking about.
At this point in the episode, we had another glitch in the recording. So this cut short. At this point, we were talking about how Frodo goes to the Undying Lands and actually does die there eventually as a mortal. That's, I guess, what Tolkien said in Morgoth's Ring. In talking about annihilationism and basically what Tolkien thinks happens to people once they die. And maybe there's something to be said with that in Lord of the Rings, especially for mortals. So, who really knows? Anyways, that's kind of where my conversation with Mark goes. And yeah, that's the next thing that we're talking about until the end of the episode. All right, so back to what you were saying about nihilism.
Yeah. So the idea is annihilationism. Is that
Annihilationism. Okay.
some people believe that when you go to hell, it's a place of eternal suffering and torment, and some people believe that hell is a place where you actually just your existence ends. So it's like a true death, and therefore Tolkien, by saying Sauron falls into eternal nothingness, is maybe leaning more towards annihilationism. But that's a conversation maybe for another day, and more appropriately for a theology podcast.
Yes, and I don't. Yeah, I don't know. I kind of always took on the opinion that Sauron's form there was, like, in a sense, you couldn't just entirely destroy it. That it would just be kind of like it would exist, not be like destroyed entirely, I guess.
Yeah, that's possible. But Sauron, he's evil, and he was defeated by the actions of, friends in some cases and family in other cases, and but ultimately by the actions of simple everyday people.
Yeah,
And that's what defeats evil in our world.
there you go.
Exactly.
All right, thanks everybody for tuning in, and catch us for our next episode coming out next week. Thanks for visiting the White City. Before you leave, please subscribe to our podcast and check us out at thewhitecitypodcast.com. We're on YouTube or Facebook under the tag @The White City Podcast.